California Senator Kamala Harris took on former Vice President Joe Biden on the issue of race. Biden faced criticism in recent weeks for an anecdote about working with segregationist senators in the 1970s as a way to highlight his ability to work with people whose views he morally opposed. Harris, among other candidates, criticized Biden for those comments, saying the story served to, quote, coddle the reputations of segregationists. Now, Thursday night saw the first public face-to-face between Harris and Biden since those comments.
It was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
It's a mischaracterization of my position across the board. I did not praise racist. That is not true, number one. Number two, if we want to have this campaign litigated on who supports civil rights and whether I did or not, I'm happy to do that.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No,
do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
Well,
I
there
did
was
not
a
oppose
failure of states to integrate public schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a local decision.
So that's where the federal government must step in. That's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
I want to bring in the Washington Post, Eugene Scott. Eugene, as Ali Vitale was saying, Harris commanded that moment. Anybody watching it would have drawn that conclusion. Before we get into the busing conversation and the civil rights conversation, what's the sense of what's your sense of what that meant for minority communities to hear this voiced from a presidential debate stage?
Well, it was significant. It was an example of representation. I think what Senator Harris did was she set the vice president up for an apology. She said it was hurtful to hear those words, but he did not do that, which is quite consistent for Vice President Joe Biden. And it was an opportunity for him to say, you know what? I did not mean to communicate what so many people thought I communicated. This is what I meant. But he didn't do that. He ended up being defensive. Even when she began to share a personal story, which many black Americans still can relate to. And I think what she was doing was having her eyes on the South Carolina primary area that Biden is leading with for many reasons, some of them because he has name recognition, also because of his association with Barack Obama. But she was helping to connect with black voters in South Carolina, saying, I know what it's like to experience some of the things many of you all have due to poor policies. And if I'm elected, I will not back ideas that further that level of discrimination and injustice.
So this moment that occurred last night, Eugene, would have been expected since the stories broke about Biden's use of the anecdote about talking to these Democratic segregationist senators. You talk about South Carolina. The majority of the Democratic primary voters there will be African American. Many of them are older. They are it seems generational. Some older Americans are a little less concerned about Biden's record in the 1970s or even his actions with respect to the confirmation of Clarence Thomas and the Anita Hill issue. There are some saying it's not fair to relitigate this. Kamala Harris doesn't seem to agree with that.
Absolutely not, because there are voters, younger voters, and some older voters who definitely want to see where Joe Biden stands in 2019 and 2020. Even those who are most gracious understand that the 1970s, the perspectives that individuals had may be very different related to education. But we now know about segregation in public schools and many issues related to race that affect the education experience of people of color. And they just want to know, moving forward, if Joe Biden would take a different position. And more importantly, they want to see if he will just say, I was wrong. I am sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. Because that's not things we hear currently coming from this president. And it's been a real problem for many black voters in South Carolina and beyond.
Let's talk about Pete Buttigieg. He has also had to deal with racial issues in the context of policing. Let's listen to this.
Look, we've taken so many steps toward police accountability that, the FOP just denounced me for too much accountability. We're obviously not there yet. So under Indiana law, this will be investigated, and there will be accountability for the officer involved.
But you're the mayor. You should fire the chief if that's the policy and someone died.
All right. What do you think? How do you think this is playing outside of South Bend, Indiana? Are voters going to find Pete Buttigieg's answers sufficient, or is it Swalwell's criticism that sticks out? Why didn't you just fire the chief?
Well, I think voters outside of South Bend are watching closely to see if this Politico, who has managed only a relatively small city, can handle the entire country. And by his own admission, he has said he has dropped the ball when it comes to the relationship between black residents of South Bend and the police department. This situation isn't over. He talked last night about an investigation. And so I think the verdict is still out. This is an opportunity for him to say that he can tackle complex, difficult issues that exist outside of his city, and that he'd have to tackle if he was the president as well. I think people are still trying to make up their minds about Buttigieg and how he handles race issues in his city and America as a whole.
And when speaking of complex issues, the candidates were asked about immigration and decriminalizing the act of entering the United States unlawfully. Let's listen.
We had a very spirited debate on this stage last night on the topic of decriminalization of the border. If you'd be so kind, raise your hand if you think it should be a civil offense rather than a crime to cross the border without documentation. Can we keep the hands up so we could see them?
And let's remember, that's not just a theoretical exercise. That criminalization, that is the basis for family separation.
All right, Eugene, this one is trickier because it may be the right thing to do for a Democratic primary audience. Could it be a liability in the general election? Donald Trump seemed to tweet that, that's the whole ball game. That is Donald Trump has been throwing at Democrats that they're the party of open borders, and that has been an unreasonable accusation. But when you talk about decriminalizing the idea of crossing the border without authorization, that could get tricky for Democrats.
Absolutely, it could be a problem, and I believe that is the point that Ali was making earlier. Those on the right, especially Donald Trump, really believe that if he can make the Democrats appear to be soft on immigration, he will continue to remain in the White House, especially with voters on the right, but even some independents who want to see harsher policies in place to curtail immigration. I think what the left is going to have to do is what we saw Buttigieg attempt to do in that issue, connect the current policies in response to immigrants to the family separation crisis, and show that perhaps if things were changing, perhaps you would not have to have policies in place that lead to deaths of families trying to get to the U.S. And so moving forward, we're going to see Democrats try to communicate that they are tough on immigration without being tough on immigrants.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.